I'm recording this myself, so don't worry. Be happy. All right, look, I need you to go ahead and get your book here, okay? A small group discussion for Korean students. Open your book to page 133. We're going to be discussing Korea's image abroad, okay? So let's read this. After we read it, what I want you to do is I want you to go back to Voxapop and I want you to answer the 10 questions, recording the answers with your microphone, okay? Good. All right, here we go. Page 133. 133? Go ahead. Here we go. Koreans care very much what people in other countries think of them. Nothing illustrated that better than the reaction of Korean people after a mass murderer who happened to have been born in Korea massacred 32 people on the campus of Virginia Tech University in the U.S. in April of 2007. So what that means, of course, is that Korean people are very concerned about what foreigners think of them, about their image abroad. And they were especially worried after a Korean national killed a bunch of people on a campus in the university in the United States back in 2007. You remember this, right? Let's continue. Koreans were shocked and embarrassed, and rightly so. But from the perspective of Americans, they grossly overreacted to the situation. To grossly overreact means that they reacted way too strongly. The Korean ambassador to the U.S. announced that he would fast for 32 days. To fast means that you go without food, that you only drink water, or you may drink orange juice, but you clean out your body. You go without food for a certain amount of time. So he decided that he would fast for 32 days, 1 day for each of the shooting victims. And Koreans considered sending money to the families of the victims to compensate for their loss. Compensate here means that they would basically give them money as sort of a sympathy present. And you can't really compensate for somebody's loss like that, but hopefully if you give them money, maybe it'll help them out. Well, nice gestures, in other words, these are nice ideas. Such behavior seemed bizarre or strange to Americans because they didn't think that Koreans bore any responsibility for the shooting. In other words, the responsibility was not on them. It wasn't Koreans' fault. The Koreans didn't do the shooting. There was just this lone gunman that did the shooting. It wasn't all of Korea. To Americans, the fact that the killer had been born in Korea was irrelevant. In other words, it didn't matter. It wasn't important. He grew up in the United States and attended American schools from when he was 8. So they didn't see a Korean, just a troubled young man who had snapped. Now, to snap means that you suddenly behave in a strange way. Usually if you snap, it means that you have some kind of a mental break, you see. So when you think of snap, you think of it being like breaking something, like a twig will snap. So think of that as being something that happens in your head. Snap, you see. And that's kind of what happened to this young man who killed all these people. He snapped. He went crazy, and suddenly his brain was not functioning, and he went wild. After the first day, most U.S. news reports didn't even mention the fact that the killer had immigrated from Korea. The focus was on his mental state, not on his ethnic background. Now look at page 134. Turn to page 134. Korean merchants living around the scene of the crime boarded up their stores. That you board up your store, that means you put boards on the window because you think that people are going to break in, assuming they would be the targets of racial attacks. Korean students enrolled at the university were in fear for their lives. In other words, they were very deeply afraid and moved around in groups for protection. Korean parents planning to send their children to study in the United States abruptly, which means suddenly, changed their plans. All these actions proved to be totally unnecessary. There was no backlash. In other words, there was no repercussions against Koreans because of this young man's actions. And the expected attacks never happened. The Korean Times printed an editorial. An editorial is a part of the newspaper where somebody gives an opinion, okay? Accusing Koreans of protecting their own, of projecting their own thinking onto Americans. In other words, Koreans think one way, and so they assume that everybody else is going to think the same way. Now, is that ethnocentric? Is that ethno-relative? Think about it. If the situation were reversed and an American killed 32 Koreans, Koreans would probably take it out on all Americans. Well, just think about how upset everybody got when those two little girls were accidentally run over by the soldiers. The fact that Americans didn't do that showed the big difference between Koreans and Americans' thinking. But the incident also showed how paranoid Koreans are about what foreigners think of them. Now, paranoid here means overly worried. If you're paranoid, you could be overly worried, you could be overly scared. They worry about how their country is being judged. In other words, how do people think about them? Maybe they worry too much. That might be because it wasn't until recently that Koreans could afford to think about such things. In other words, they didn't have time to think about such things. Until the mid-1980s, Korea's primary focus, or what Koreans were focused on, was the military situation with the North. Korea was just breaking out of poverty. In other words, they were just getting out of poverty. They were starting their rags to riches ascent. And foreign visitors were rare. Foreign visitors didn't come to Korea very much. That all changed with the 1986 Asian Games in Busan and the Summer Olympics in Seoul in 1988. With those two historic events, Korea's doors were swung wide open. In other words, you think about Korea being a country and been closed all this time, and now suddenly it was wide open and everybody started coming in. And the Korean tourist industry was born. Now let's go to page 135. Okay. People who are old enough to remember what the country's mood was like during the lead up to the 1988 Olympics will remember how extremely worried Koreans were about how their country was going to be depicted in the foreign media. Now, in other words, their mood is the way that they think, how they feel. The lead up is the time that happens at the beginning that's right before an event happens. So the lead up to the 1988 Olympics would be all that happened in 1987 and then what happened in the first part of 1988 up until the Olympics started. And then when you depict somebody, that means you show them. So in other words, they were worried about how Koreans were going to be shown in the foreign media. They knew that news organizations from all over the world would be in the country with hundreds of reporters and TV cameras, and it was going to be Korea's first performance on the world stage since the Korean War, an event that they desperately wanted to put behind them. To put behind you, if you want to put something behind you, it means that you want to put it in your past and not think about it, not have it be part of your life anymore. Koreans wanted to control where reporters could go and what their cameras could show. But they knew that the foreign media wasn't used to having its hands tied. In other words, the foreign media had always had freedom. They had always had access. It wasn't a question of whether or not they were going to have somebody tell them what they could report. They weren't going to have their hands tied. They were going to go out and do their reporting and express how they felt. News organizations in Western countries are used to operating on an anything goes basis. An anything goes basis means that you can do whatever you want. So if there were some things that the Korean government didn't want to show, didn't want shown, they'd have to hide them. So in other words, the Korean government then decided, well, we're going to have to hide these things. That's just what they did. During the Olympics, soldiers patrolling the streets wore street clothes instead of military uniforms. Street clothes are basically any kind of clothes, just not military uniforms. Military bases were disguised as companies, and the soldiers guarding them wore civilian clothes. Civilian clothes, street clothes, same thing. Koreans were afraid that the presence of soldiers and military bases would scare foreigners away. In other words, they didn't want to show all the military bases because people thought, oh my goodness, we're going to be in a war. Restaurants selling dog meat were closed in areas where foreigners were likely to visit. And street vendors, pochangmacha, you probably can say that better than I can, were banned because foreigners might think they were unsanitary. Unsanitary means not clean. Much has changed in the last 2 decades since 1988, but one thing that hasn't changed is how much Koreans worry about what foreigners think of them. All right, so that's our first reading out of this book. Now what I want you to do is I want you to go back to Vox Pop, and I want you to answer the discussion questions one by one. Okay? Do that right now.